Hi everyone, I'm here with Walter Bosley, filmmaker, former secret agent, maybe he's currently a secret agent, but if he was, he wouldn't tell us. Author, publisher, raconteur, man about town, guy who hangs out in the desert, all that sort of stuff. We call him the Scorpion Man. Anyway, Walter Bosley, calling in from somewhere in Southern California. Hello, Walter, how are you?
Oh, how you doing? I'm doing good. Good to be here.
How's the weather in Southern California? And I only ask because it's pouring rain here in Halifax.
You probably don't want to know. I went out and did my almost 2 mile walk I do every day, and it was nice. It was just a touch of a cool breeze in an otherwise sunny, warm day, and so it's about one of the few good things about being in California right now.
What would all the bad things be? Besides your state about to go bankrupt or whatever.
Other than that, everything's just peachy. Yeah, it's just kind of, things are kind of slow, you might say, in California right now. But we got the weather.
At the end of every episode, I let the listener, I'm warning you in advance, I usually don't warn people, I let the listener pick the play-out music now. So, for instance, yesterday, Aaron Gullius picked The Clash, London Calling. So, put your thinking cap on, think about what song you might want me to play out, and no request is too crazy. So I'll play anything, literally, with the possible exception of the Ramones, just to tick Nick Redfern off. But even if you wanted the Ramones, I'd play the Ramones. But I'd probably play something like Pet Sematary.
Okay, well then I'll be thinking about this as we talk. Part of my brain.
Now, if it's a Dvorak symphony that goes on for 60 minutes, I might not go for that. But if it's something shorter.
I'll think of a good one.
No Jingle Cats.
No.
Yeah, or Jingle Dogs or Jingle Mice or whatever. So we're not going to be talking about UFOs. This will be the only time we talk about UFOs to say that we're not going to be talking about UFOs, because Walter doesn't talk about UFOs anymore. I should ask you why you don't talk about UFOs anymore, but for anybody who read his Facebook page, they would know, I think.
I'll answer it here, though.
Okay.
That particular question. It's honestly because I think I've said just about all I can say on that issue.
But that's never stopped you before. No, I'm just kidding.
It should have, probably.
Yeah, that's right. It should have stopped him. It should have stopped me. It should have stopped everyone else. It should have stopped Stan Friedman sometime in 1988. No, that's terrible. I'll probably cut that part out.
He's more in depth, and he has more to say about it than I do. So, he can keep.
Yeah, it's a career option for him, which is not a criticism. It's what he does. And for you and I, it just happened to be something that we chatted about every now and then. So...
do it on a personal level, just not publicly.
Right. So if we're sitting in the farmer's market in the food court, we can talk about UFOs. But why would we? Because there'd be so many more interesting things to talk about, which is the point, I guess.
Yes, I agree with you.
So what are we going to talk about? Well, we'll talk about Walter's book, Empire of the Wheel. We'll talk about his publishing empire. We'll talk about movies, maybe. We'll definitely talk about Greg Bishop behind his back.
Yes.
And, that's probably about it. So let's get right into Walter's book, Empire of the Wheel. I'm just going to let people know, Walter, I've got your book here in front of me. I'm just going to go right into the prologue. Give me about a minute. I'm just going to read the first paragraph to give them an idea of what they're in for. Because the first paragraph, I like the first paragraph. Now, the other 200 pages after that, we'll talk about that. No, I'm just kidding. But the first paragraph is awesome. So here it is, folks. It's a little section we like to call literary theater, where I'm going to read from a selection here by Walter. Her face hit the water. She did not gently submerge. There was nothing gentle about it. It was well into autumn, and the water was cold. Her body, though clothed, was ill protected from the shock of chill convulsing through her limbs. A whumping sound in her ears had preceded the muffled near silence of the depths of the dark and murky lake, black as starless midnight. She might have felt the debris and other organic minutiae against her exposed skin, but she panicked. Clips of grass, grains of soil, the excrement of fish and fowl, any number of things tossed or washed into the lake enveloped her body. In her desperate reflex to capture oxygen into her lungs, such refuse passed into her open mouth and filled her throat, some of it catching between her teeth. Disgust, secondary to the terror of drowning. Wow. Okay, so it's clearly not a travel book.
No.
It's like, oh, look, here we are in Hungary. You should go to this place in Budapest. So that's they always say the first couple scenes in a film, the first page or two of a book, hook them. Whatever you're doing, hook them. Well, that's hooking. That's a good opening paragraph. Maybe you can tell folks where it leads, who this person that you're talking about there is, why she's sort of the jump-off point and one of the central characters. What is the Empire of the Wheel all about?
Well, yeah, all about. That's the big statement there. I opened it that way. Well, Rick and I agreed to that was a section I had written early on in the writing of the book, and I just felt that was Rick and I agreed that was the strongest opening, because essentially that person that's drowning is the woman known as Cora Stanton. And what I wanted to do was present the horror of what she was going through when she died. And that's that whole section, and it continues on there and describes what her body goes through and such. That was based on the research I'd done on what a human body goes through when someone drowns, and also at the same time is poisoned. She was found drowned in the lake at a park that no longer exists. And it was discovered she had poison in her stomach also. So the woman died a very miserable death. And it's a reflection on, a lot of the dark things that the more I looked, the more I found were surrounding 7 questionable deaths that occurred in late 1915, 5 of them within just a few weeks of each other. It really is, I felt, the way to just kick off this mystery was to jump right in, so to speak, with that particular death. And the reason I start with her, because she's actually the 5th person to die in the mystery. She's the central figure.
And we should mention, I should mention, by the way, that the book is co-written with Richard B. Spence. So it's not just you. You had a co-author on this, right?
Right, yes. I had been investigating this mystery for about a year and a half, and was just starting, beginning to outline and form what the book would be. And Rick, who's the author of a few other books, one in particular, Secret Agent 666, that involves Aleister Crowley's journey from New York to California and back east again in 1915. I was astonished to find how much the Crowley trip that I just outlined paralleled the events, the things going on with my mystery. So I had contacted Rick as a source, and he was sending me just all sorts of great info, and his info was really helping develop what I knew about what was going on. So I kind of pitched him, one day I said, hey, why don't you write this thing with me? And by that time he was hooked on the details of everything, and so he said yeah, and it worked. I think it worked really well, because he brought a big chunk of essential material to the book, and he's a history professor at the University of Idaho, so he brought that scholar's eye to the whole thing.
Well, let me ask you, because co-writing is always an interesting process. I co-wrote the play Doing Time with Mac Tonys, and based on one of his short stories, and we weren't in the same city, obviously, so what we did was just we back and forthed it through email, and I wound up adapting and writing most of it, and he wound up looking at what I had written and then offering suggestions. How did your writing relationship with Richard work in terms of just the logistics of it all?
Well, we did the same thing. We've never met face-to-face.
Oh, really?
Really, yeah. We've only spoke on the phone a couple of times. It's been pretty much 90% email contact. We've done radio interviews together, of course. We were on Radio Mysterioso together and a couple other ones. It worked out really well. There are portions, when you get into the book, especially the portions about German intelligence in World War I era, the background of that, and the Crowley stuff, his movements and who he was meeting with, that's mostly Rick. And when you get into like the opening there, that was something I had written. But probably the more colorful stuff that would drive the skeptics crazy, that's probably the stuff that was more me. I say that with a nod to, yes, I know I'm the melodramatic one, because, I write fiction as well, as you know, and do movies. And it was a really good, but then also there's a good portion of what you read that is not the colorful, dramatic stuff, that is really from almost like, it's not written like a report of investigation, but it's that's me too, because I'm also an investigator. I know how to turn the drama off and write in that regard too. But what we would do is each one of us would, like if I drafted a chapter, I'd send it to Rick, and then he'd do his number on it. He'd go through and make whatever changes, or he wrote a chapter, he'd send it to me, and I'd revise it. And so there was quite a bit of each of us having our hand in it, so that I believe just about every chapter is, pretty close to equal each of us. So
it's not like a Lennon and McCartney song where you can go, oh, Hey Jude is a Paul McCartney song, and Across the Universe is a John Lennon song mostly. This is sort of a 50-50 thing right down the middle.
Most people who know me and who know us, they can tell who wrote what parts. They'll be reading through a chapter and they'll go, oh, this section, these pages were written by Rick, and oh, okay, I can recognize the stuff written by Walter. But there are more places than one might imagine where we actually blend together. Where we blend together and come together in the style is when I've got my investigator writer hat on, not my creative writer hat on, because then I'm much more like what a history professor would do. You research, you investigate, and basically you're reporting what you find.
So let's talk a bit about the mystery in particular. Let's start off with, how did you run across this mystery? Were you just walking down the street someday and a person came up to you and said, oh, I need to tell you about this mystery from 100 years ago. Can you help me? Which is how it would happen in a film, of course. How did you find it, though?
It was maybe almost like that in a way. As you know, I had written the Goofy Disneyland book, and there's a lot of people who like that book, actually, so I only say Goofy with affection. But I had written the book about Disneyland and the ley lines and the intersection of the three ley lines, and after that, during the time I was finishing that book, and this was the period that, and I kind of have to tell this just to get the story right, I was doing some interesting stuff with remote viewing, experimenting with remote viewing. And what that did was that opened me up to noticing synchronicities and threads. And during the time I was finishing the Disneyland book for publication, I was in a period of intense synchronicity, you might say. So I was looking at some very interesting, weird aspects of the Disneyland and ley line research and such. And what it led to was, wow, what if I followed the ley lines from that intersect in Disneyland off the Disneyland property and out through where they go through Southern California? And I found that two of them come looping way out here by what we down here call the Inland Empire, which is mostly San Bernardino and Riverside, two cities that kind of rose up together. And so I thought, well, what if there's paranormal activity reported in association with these ley lines in the area? So I was looking around Riverside, and because one of the lines goes right through Riverside, and I was finding some very strange things associated with the murder of two police officers that remains unsolved to this day, and also the presence, it appears, of voodoo, some undercurrent of voodoo in the area. And I've actually discovered, and then of course there was the Zodiac killing victim Sherry Jo Bates, who was murdered in downtown Riverside on the campus of Riverside Community College, Riverside City College then. And I had actually discovered this weird darkness in Riverside when I then decided to look into any strange stuff in San Bernardino. And what I found was a ghost story at what is called the Inland Center Mall. And I went and talked to the lady who was the source of that ghost story that I'd found on the internet. She's a librarian here in our local library system, a woman named Ann Walker. And she told me that she had been working in the store in the mall that was allegedly haunted by this woman who, and she believed was this woman who died of drowning in 1915. And told me her name, Cora Stanton, and she said, go check the newspapers of the day and you'll see what I'm talking about. So I did, and that was the eureka moment. I went to the special collections room at the library downtown and began looking at the newspapers, and I noticed more than just the Cora Stanton death being, mysterious and having some questionable aspects to it. I see that these two children are poisoned to death, and I see that there is this young girl, a 14-year-old girl, who is poisoned to death, and they're never able to identify the poison. And then there's, the two men who have, shot themselves, committed suicide. So I see, these three alleged suicides and these three children, that die of poisoning mysteriously. And this woman, Cora Stanton, who drowns in the lake in this park, which used to be where this Inland Center Mall is now. And all this stuff, all these things that, that I'm throwing out here at you now, it just kept building and building, and I'm looking at the newspaper accounts, and with my investigator hat on, I just kind of sit back and I go, wait a minute. These deaths, my gut's telling me there's some connection between them. There's just something funny going on here, because as I said before, 5 of these deaths happen within days or just a couple of weeks of each other, and then even the other 2, one of the bodies is discovered within 24 hours of the woman drowning. So it's just it's this very strange thing to me. It shocks me and startles me, with how much at the time that they're not saying, that nobody seems to be saying, hey, wait a minute, there's some other problem here. So it was kind of like a bombshell for me, all of that, just boom, boom, boom. It just kept piling on. And, I had all sorts of threads to pull, and I just started pulling them. And by pulling those threads, it began to kind of unweave the fabric that had been woven to cover it up, because even though this was all over the newspapers in 1915, by January of 1916, all of this had disappeared completely from the local media. And it wasn't until 97 years later that, with Rick and I coming out with the book, that it was ever talked about in public again.
A couple of questions out of that. First of all, let's go back to 1915, 1916, in terms of just the coverage, because we're used today on the internet, on the interweb, everywhere. I mean, yeah. You couldn't kill somebody and not hear about it. Just look at the coverage worldwide of the body parts killer, shall we call it, up here in Canada, where they sent various body parts to various people, and the next thing you know, they're arresting the guy. I think they arrested him in Germany, I'm not sure, but it was on international news all of a sudden, almost instantaneously. The story just spreads like wildfire. You can even go back, we were talking earlier before we started recording, to the O.J. Simpson trial, and just the massive media. I mean, you'd be hard pressed to find somebody, at least in the Western world, who was not familiar with that case at that time. Now, clearly in the Simpson trial, there was celebrity at work as well, but what happened, what kind of reportage was there of all of these cases back in 1915, 1916, in an era before the internet and television, even radio? And did anybody back then draw any of the links that you came to draw almost a century later?
Well, that's a really good aspect that you bring up. First of all, the quality of the reporting is what you might expect, and that's not. I'm not being really disparaging there. It's because from paper to paper there were things they got wrong which astonished me, but it was the sensation of its day, because if you're talking just coverage, who was covering this, you had 2 papers in San Bernardino. You had one in Redlands. Of course, you had the Riverside paper. Now, this story was all over those papers, the San Bernardino papers and the Redlands paper. And, it was making the Riverside papers as well. But we're talking, a daily thing in the Purdue and Redlands papers. But it also was being reported in in papers in Utah. Now that's because historically there was a Mormon connection. The people who settled San Bernardino, the city as we know it, were Mormon settlers. So you had a lot of people with relatives in San Bernardino still, so it would be news. Anything that happened in San Bernardino would be news in Salt Lake. But also, I believe, York or New Jersey, there was a story on it, and up in San Francisco, there was some coverage of this. And so the coverage for its day, it was briefly, of course, somewhat of a sensation in certain places, particularly locally. Going back to the quality, back then, anytime they could report on something that had any sensational aspect, they would do it. What's interesting is there was some talk of potential foul play, but I was amazed at how that was just kind of quick and brief, and nobody seemed to go there. I'm left with, when you read the newspaper accounts, you're left with the impression that the police certainly would have thought the very same things that Rick and I thought. We just weren't saying anything because the press was beating up on them. And if you know the history of Walter Shea, who was the police chief at the time, and the other investigators, you come away going, okay, these guys weren't that stupid. And they were probably doing the thing that investigators do. You keep certain facts close to vest, to not hurt your investigation. But it is interesting how, as I'm reading this, I'm looking at it going, holy cow, you had some type of homicidal maniac loose in your town, and that is never even brought up. Nobody brings up that all or most of these deaths could have been done by one person. They're just reporting it as, golly, these kids ate poison candy, and they don't know where they got it. They don't even speculate. Was there a stranger in town? They just say, well, the parents were cleared. It had nothing to do with them. And, the girl who died after eating, what is believed to be a poisoned orange, they don't get into at all. Nobody even brings up, is there some madman running around? Which in my mind, I was looking at this going, holy moly here. This isn't, this can't be. They because at that time in 1915, there had already been, of course, Jack the Ripper, and, there had been other crazies who had done some things. The serial killer meme wasn't as strong as it is today, of course, but it wasn't an unheard of. They had H.H. Holmes in the 1890s, and it is kind of surprising when you read the newspaper accounts that nobody seems to go there or want to go there.
What you have then will stipulate that perhaps you found a serial killer, and I'll always say perhaps, but let's say you did find a serial killer 100 years later, but that's not all that your book is about, because that would just be a true crime story. Be like, okay, we found this serial killer. I've dug into it, we've kind of investigated, and we think we've solved the case, or at least we've shown there's a serial killer. Here's kind of the story about the people involved. It's an interesting human interest story, and here's an idea, this guy might be the killer, sort of thing. But there's actually I'll use the term paranormal element to it, and I use paranormal in it. Not UFOs, folks. I'll use it in its broadest term. But there's an esoteric, maybe that's a better word to use, an esoteric element to this. That takes it far beyond just another crime story. So perhaps you could tell everyone a bit about that esoteric element and a bit about the stuff that folks, if they're reading it just thinking, oh, it's a true crime story, they might go, wait a second now, hold on, how did we get Aleister Crowley in here? And how did we get all of these other sort of aspects and espionage and the supernatural and all? How does that all fit in?
This is a book of questions. Many people expect to have all, you read a book about something, like questionable deaths or potential murder or whatever. And many people say, okay, I'm going to read this, and by gosh, I'm going to have answers. And if not answers, they're going to give me a flat-out opinion of what they think. And this, if that's the kind of book you're looking for, you will not like Empire of the Wheel, because the mystery raises many more questions than it answers. And it raises more questions than apparently the people at the time were recognizing. So it is a different book in that regard. And then, of course, there's the esoteric element. Now, I want to clarify that Rick and I agreed that anything esoteric we present, we're presenting it in the spirit of and in the theory that this is what motivated the killer or killers. If we're right that there was a killer or killers, there could have been more than one. We think that the evidence strongly suggests that they were motivated by their ideas of what result they thought they would get by murdering people, adults and children, in particular places because of what they believed about that particular spot. But again, it's the esoteric part of this. It goes into the details on that. It goes into some analysis of that. But we're very clear that we think this is essential to the degree that it was what was motivating the killer, what was going on in their mind. In other words, you don't have to believe in these esoteric paranormal principles discussed in the book. We're saying the killers believed in it, or the killer.
It's an important distinction that some people don't make.
Right. I think sometimes, they'll read this and they'll think the authors believe wholeheartedly in what, and we just don't get into that in the book. Where Rick and I might differ to what degree we put stock in any of the esoteric ideas, neither one of us go into that in the book. I like to tell people, if you want to know where I lean on that, read the novel that's kind of a companion to it. The novel I Will See You in Time, which I wrote concurrently as Rick and I were writing the nonfiction book. But that's the fun bubblegum aspect. But this book, we wanted to present, what we found. And that's the interesting thing about the esoteric element in this story is this is what we were finding as we pulled threads. This is what we were finding as we looked at it through the eyes of someone who would look at things, in this regard. It's spooky at times. To me, it's spooky anytime some guy thinks that, he or she is going to, gain some type of supernatural power through the, violent murder of another human being.
It's kind of like something out of a Buffy the Vampire Slayer episode.
Yeah.
All these cult people in their robes going, if we just killed the virgin, then, Cthulhu will show up or whatever. I don't think they ever summoned Cthulhu in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but
they should have.
What haven't we done? We've thrown everything in the kitchen sink in. I don't think we've done Cthulhu yet. Oh, awesome. Let's just bring Cthulhu in. And some guy sitting in the room in the production meeting going, I don't know if we really want to mess with that one. That maybe we want to just let that one alone.
And of course, you mentioned, in the middle of all this, we have Aleister Crowley.
Right. Why do we have Aleister Crowley in the middle of all of this, though? Tease the people, Walter. Tease them. What's in here with Aleister Crowley?
Well, it turns out that our friend Mr. C was in the area at the time of these events, and I was kind of proud of myself because I'm the one who pretty much confirmed that. I mentioned Rick's book, Secret Agent 666, and in that book it's an awesome book if you're interested in Aleister Crowley and all the World War I intrigues and such. Read that book. It's fantastic, and it's a good companion, in a way to Empire of the Wheel. But he was in California and in Southern California in late 1915, in the fall of 1915, and I was able to pretty much prove, short of seeing a receipt or a record book with his name, the archives of the railroad. San Bernardino is a major railroad hub city. It still is. It was back then. Anything going on or through the railroad, be it freight or passengers, from California to the rest of the United States, from Southern California to the rest of the United States, or from the rest of the United States through Southern California, went through San Bernardino. Now, 1915 was also the period, not just of World War I, but of the Mexican War. And due to the Mexican War, the southernmost rail routes were not used for passenger traffic because, Pancho Villa and all those guys were coming back and forth and there were hostilities. So all passenger traffic was routed on a more northerly route, going through northern Arizona, northern New Mexico, and such on and so forth, to avoid the dangerous zone of the Mexican War. Now, that meant that all this passenger traffic from San Diego and anywhere in Southern California that had to go east had to go through San Bernardino. And their archives have these wonderful photographs of the trains just overloaded. I mean, they would have all the passengers, come out of the car and stand there on the back rail area and standing down along there, showing all these passenger trains just filled to capacity because everybody was having to channel through San Bernardino. And Crowley had left San Diego on the particular date that he had left there and headed eastward on his return leg of the trip, and he wanted to go through the Grand Canyon. We know it's a matter of record that he was in San Diego. He went to La Jolla to visit Catherine Tingley at the Theosophy compound, which is an interesting story in itself. And then we know for a fact that he went to the Grand Canyon. And the railroads that he used and the records of the railroad show that he had to have gone through San Bernardino in around the first week or so of November 1915, not too long before Cora Stanton is found floating dead, during the time that, like the couple of the children were poisoned or that kind of thing. Now, there's some people, and I was able to confirm that because of these railroad records. So we have Aleister Crowley and everything he brings with him in the mix here, and this would lead some people to say, aha, that evil dark guy, he had to have been involved in this. Well, here's what's interesting. After all the research I did and educating myself even more on Crowley, my personal opinion and what we agree on, Rick and I agree on, and it's in the book, is that not only was Crowley not directly involved in these deaths, we believe that the evidence that exists about the man and the circumstances and the details of that time, he would have been very much opposed to any person or group that an esoterically motivated or occult motivated person or group that would have been the perpetrators of this. He would have been opposed to it. And that goes against what a lot of people who haven't really studied Crowley, they just know his reputation and what they've heard of him, that goes against what their reaction is when they hear that he was in the area. I mean, I know some people that even after reading the book, they still insist, no, Crowley was involved in some way, you've got it all wrong. But I think when you think of Crowley's reputation, wow, for Crowley to be offended and opposed to something, that suggests that it's pretty dark.
So was it just a coincidence then that he was in the area, coming through the area at that particular time? Or is there a linkage that you see in some other way?
I think that Crowley was, if there was something going on that was occult motivated, this is something that was probably known in certain circles, or let's say suspected in certain esoteric occult circles. I think Crowley might have been aware of it in the way that when you're in the spook world, in the intelligence community, you get little snippets of intel. I think his intel had given him, a clue that there was something going on that was of of the nature that happened. And I think that whereas, yes, the rail travel forced him to go through, I think he would have probably have gone through San Bernardino anyway. Because here's the interesting thing. As you know, the book gets into the subject of ley lines, which we identify with telluric current. And it's interesting that from the time Crowley left New York, his entire little trip he took out west, this big trip, every major stop he made, our guy who provided us the geomorphological info identifying where the telluric currents are, is where our guy had identified major nodal points of telluric current ley lines flowing through the area. Now, what's interesting about that is this gentleman had provided me with a map that he had done by hand, and I had that map over a year before I even knew anything. So this was kind of part of the shocker. When I read Rick Spence's book on Secret Agent 666 on Crowley's journey, I already had this map for quite a while, several months, and I'm reading the book and I'm going, wait a minute, he stopped here, I look at the map, well, there's a major nodal point of telluric current energy. And Detroit, Seattle, the places in Canada and San Diego, and I thought, well, this is kind of eerie. This is very strange. And so going back to Crowley and what I think about his involvement is that I think Crowley was purposely visiting these areas for whatever reasons. In the book we discussed that it was possibly intelligence related for military technology reasons. But because what happened in San Bernardino very possibly involved a knowledge of this telluric current, I think that Crowley was aware that something was going to happen, something strange was going to happen, and I think he wanted to come through San Bernardino. And if that's the case, there's one guy in all of this that we think he probably would have wanted to talk with, because that would be the one guy who would probably be able to talk in his same language, and that was Walter Franklin Prince, who, and this was another shocker for me, Walter Franklin Prince of Boston, the American Psychical Research Association, he was the rector of an Episcopalian church here in San Bernardino at the time of this mystery. Well, that is a big red flag as far as when the whole case starts getting into the spiritualists' involvement and their presence. Anyway, I think Crowley, if there was anybody in town that he probably would have wanted to meet with or made a point to talk to, it would have been Prince. And unfortunately, there's no way to find any record if Crowley was in town a few hours or a few days, and then of course no way to find out if he met anybody at the train station or what have you. But there are all sorts of circumstances and reasons for Crowley to have maybe been aware that there was something going on here.
Although you would understand that there would be many people who would read the book and they would go, you know what? He was just taking a train ride back east, and he happened to be he had to go through San Bernardino. It's purely a coincidence, and you guys are spinning something out of that just isn't there.
People can say that about anything, really, when you think about it. I would say, okay, this sort of thing is, this sort of theory, this hypothesis put together is just not that particular person's cup of tea. Okay, I'm okay with that. If someone's just, that's just not their thing, and they don't see the fabric in that way, and that's okay, because we could be nuts, totally misreading all this. But here's the thing: as an investigator, a criminal investigator, for me. Generally, the old adage, where there's smoke, there's fire. To me, I see flames causing the smoke of the Crowley presence. It's just, I believe less in coincidence. The more experience I got as an investigator, and of course, the more I research and dig into things, I believe in less in coincidence. There's usually something there. And what it is exactly, for all I know, we could be wrong. Crowley could have been the mastermind of all this. An interesting thing, though, as you know, having read the book, the only time Cora Stanton is witnessed alive in town is she walked into a doctor's office and she made an enigmatic statement before walking out. She said, "Who is a liar? He is not here." Now, we get into that in the book and we analyze the possibilities there. And we present the idea that she was in town to meet someone and missed them. Well, it would be really interesting, and we present why this would be interesting in greater detail in the book. It'd be really interesting if perhaps the person Cora Stanton was supposed to meet was Crowley, and maybe they missed each other just by days. Or maybe she was an intelligence agent, and she was one of his sources or a contact he was supposed to meet. So there's a possible reason also why Crowley might have, made a point to make sure he came through San Bernardino. Because, as you know, in the book we present the circumstances of all the espionage that was going on in California at the time between the Germans, the British, and the East Indians.
Right. I think it's probably pretty safe to say, without fear of contradiction, that different people could read the book, and at its baseline, you seem to have uncovered, a real potential serial killer. So, leaving aside any of the esoteric stuff, there seems to be something here that is real, and I think that's probably as far as a lot of people would take it. They'd say, okay, fine.
And that's fine, because there's enough. If you don't take it beyond that, there's clearly something weird going on, and there's enough there to entertain the idea that there was a killer.
Right. And you could even, so that's one level. Another level of people would be those that might go a little further and say, okay, serial killer and maybe occult motivated, we can follow you that far, without endorsing whether or not the occult is real or anything like that, realizing that there are some people who think it is and have been known to use violent means to try and invoke their occult powers that they believe they have. No problem there. That's possible too. I think where you might lose a lot of people would be the third leap, which is, okay, we've gone that far, but now you're into ley lines, you're into Aleister Crowley, you're into a lot of things that I think to a lot of people would seem like coincidences, but to you they don't. That's okay. I'm just curious, because you're working, how's this for a segue? You're working on Empire of the Wheel 2. Are you following up on that, I'll call it the third leap, which, for anyone who knows, The Third Man is my reference to one of my favorite films. The Third Leap. Are you following up on any of the Third Leap stuff, or are you going back and focusing more on the serial killer stuff? Or what have you found? What kind of new information have you found that might confirm the third leap that you made in the first book, and might take some of those people who go, well, that's a bridge too far for us, as I drop another film reference, and say, well, wait a second, he's putting more building blocks into the bridge.
Yes. It's all of that. There is more serial killer mystery. There's, of course, more esoterica. Remember, here's the thing that makes the third leap easier, and we say this repeatedly in the book. We're not saying that you have to believe that any of the ley line stuff is real or true. What we're trying to say is we think that if the killers were occult or esoteric motivated, that they believe. We're saying that this is in the mind of esoteric motivated killer, so that it makes it more palatable for the person who just puts no stock in any of that. Because, again, I think, and Rick agrees, and several other people that have read the material and seen the material that we've brought together, whether you personally believe in ley line magic or whatever, it's a really, when you base how we identify the ley lines, this is why we identified them as telluric current, because telluric current is a very real thing. That's not fantasy. And we state, and I say this a lot, that what people commonly like to refer to these days as ley energy is actually probably they mean telluric current. And that is energy that actually runs through the ground. And again, this is a very real thing. And so what we're saying is, couched in those terms, we're talking about people that might very well believe all these much wilder things about this. And I mean, if you're talking about somebody that's willing to go to the point of homicide, sociopathic homicide, then I don't see it, Rick, we don't see it as a big leap that they might have believed that doing it on this so-called ley line would, be this powerful thing for them. They're already a homicidal maniac.
Right.
So and in analyzing what might have motivated them, we understand them better, and then maybe we can better solve the mystery or recognize if somebody in our times, it kind of serves, it's basically like what you do as an intel analyst. You take what's there, regardless of your opinion, your personal opinion of the what's there. You take what's there and you look, you try to factor in, okay, what does my subject, what does my killer think about this? Because that's what we're analyzing here. That's what we're trying to identify. And going back to the telluric current, because that's a very real thing, there is a way to identify where these currents would be and are located, how they flow. And it was just a real interesting, I'll use the word coincidence, but it was a real interesting connection that when you looked at where these victims were killed and such, it just happened to correspond to where these telluric energy currents flow. So we present it as best we can in the book to connect those dots rather than have it be just really a true 100% leap. But again, we emphasize that this is what we think was going on in the mind of the killers. And yes, the second book, it does involve that, but it presents, more than just that. And what's interesting is it gets into an association between this and cultures that practiced human sacrifice in ancient times, which they did it in association with special sacred spots they believed on the earth that happened to correspond to this energy grid.
Speaking of associations, you've drawn an association, if you will, or a link between what you think happened in San Bernardino in 1915 and the Zodiac killer. Maybe you could talk a bit about that, because now we're into time travel, in a sense.
Of course.
Your theory is that it's something that's not just related to one time in one place and it happened and it was over. Your theory is that it's the broader picture continued on and maybe is still continuing on.
Well, and it's more grounded in reality than time travel, of course. But
so says somebody who has clearly never time traveled.
I've been caught. It's part of the knowledge of the Zodiac case that he spent some time down here in the Inland Empire. Obviously, one of his victims was murdered in downtown Riverside. There's some of the suspects that were closely looked at were living in the greater Inland Empire at the time. There is indeed an actual Inland Empire association to the Zodiac killer case. Now, that said, the assumption there, based on the evidence, is that he lived in this area for a while. Now, if he lived in this area, he would also have had access to some of the same sources I had. Because remember, this was all in the newspapers of the day in 1915. For whatever reason, had he learned, say, I learned about it through a ghost story at a mall, had he learned, about the Coruscanton, mystery when he was living here, and he looked in the same papers I looked at, he might have noticed the same things I did in the research that Rick and I did, present in the book, and being the sociopath that he is or was, I think it's more of a copycat situation. That here you had a sociopathic guy that's like, oh, I think I see what they're doing, and wow, I think I'll do this. And so that's the we'll call the real world, firm connection theory between Zodiac in this case. Where it gets strange is, first thing that pops into mind is the thing with the giant arrowhead. And again, I think this is something Zodiac did consciously, okay? But we have a feature out here in the San Bernardino Mountains. It's called the Arrowhead. It is a natural, it's a formation in the natural terrain that is shaped like an arrowhead, complete with the flangey, part that would connect to an arrow shaft. And what's interesting is this thing is oriented to 17 degrees, which is magnetic north. Okay? And if you follow the point of the arrowhead points southwest. If you follow this arrowhead, right through through San Bernardino and down to Riverside, the arrowhead points to where the Zodiac killer, murdered Sherry Jo Bates. And I think that he chose that site on purpose. I think he consciously knew he was picking a site that the arrowhead would point to, because I think he was into these things. And, of course, our guy who identified the telluric current grid layout, as it were, in San Bernardino, he identified, and this is prior to the research, that's what's weird, he identified a major configuration of this energy right there in downtown, and the Zodiac, the site that he chose to kill this girl, is right on that configuration, and the arrowhead points to it, and that's then as you dig deeper, and we present in the book, the idea that there's a particular goddess associated with all this, and that is Hecate. Hecate, this ancient goddess, is traditionally venerated in many cultures through the number 100, specifically in two sets of 50. And in 1915, the Zodiac Killer emerges around the mid-60s, around 1965. He emerges. That's 50 years later. Now, as we get into in the book, may imply that might suggest that there's something going on in veneration of Hecate. Will some crazy guy, some psychopath, want to close out the cycle in 2015? Will something like this happen again? Now that's a leap, just for the sake of discussion. Towards the end of the book, that's kind of one of those little titillating things you put in the end of the book there that is legitimate to be brought up, but it's you can stop short of that if you like. But there's enough presented in the book, in the Zodiac chapter, to, I think, make people... And the biggest one is that all of the Zodiac attacks and deaths, murders, took place in association with these current ley line grids.
I actually wrote a song once when I was a musician called A Drawing Down, and in the middle eighth, we specifically reference Aleister Crowley, something that an old friend of mine, when I was in law school, although he's an old friend from high school, but we wound up in law school together, he lived in the law school fraternity. We used to go to his room, drink heavily, and light little fires on the floor, which, it's amazing we didn't burn the place down because it was an old wooden house, and sort of try and evoke the spirit of Aleister Crowley, because we both had an interest in Aleister Crowley. So, this is my way of saying that in 2015, I'm heading out to California, because I could be the next Zodiac Killer.
Oh, God. Don't say that now, because if that stuff starts happening, they're going to...
Yeah, people are going to come looking for me in 2015. I was going to pin it on Greg Bishop, but I couldn't do that, so I'm going to take the rap myself. Now, I am making fun of you, but I'm doing it in a good-natured way, because we were getting very serious there for a second. So now this is me lightening the mood.
Yes.
Because it's a serious subject. Personally, I think Gene Steinberg is the Zodiac Killer, but...
You know what I actually think about that? Because there's a whole little cottage industry, there's a whole little community out there that's into the Zodiac Killer, and there's a lot...
Think about what? The idea that Gene Steinberg might be the Zodiac Killer? That explains so much.
But here's the thing: there's some guys out there that they think that they feel like they're really going to solve it. In other words, they're going to identify who the Zodiac Killer actually is or was. And we say in the book, our book does not get into who. We're just analyzing what we think was motivating.
Right.
And my personal belief as an investigator, professional investigator, I think it's too late. I think with each day now, we're decades away from the last killing, and as each day goes by, the chance that we're ever going to identify who he was or is fading. And I really don't think it's likely that we're going to be able to identify who the Zodiac Killer is or was. I think that the most we can do is further pull out and identify modus operandi and things that motivated him, and other things surrounding the identity that might help us find more bodies. Because he did claim that there were 37 more bodies in Southern California that the authorities never found.
It's the same kind of thing as the Jack the Ripper mystery. I mean, they're never going to solve it by being able to say, unless you find a signed confession from some guy saying, yep, I'm the guy, I did it, and with proof, here's where I did it, here's some things that only I could have known. Oh, okay, so you're Jack the Ripper, fine. Oh, okay, you're the Zodiac Killer, fine. Oh, okay, this is what happened at Roswell, fine. There's just certain things that when the passage of time goes along, and then what happens is you wind up with groups. Roswell's a good example. I'll just use that because this will be the UFO moment. You don't have to say a word. But, there's the Project Mogul people. I'm one of them who accept that that's the explanation. There's people who accept that it was an alien spacecraft. There's Nick Redfern's Body Snatchers in the Desert, Japanese Fugu balloon thing. And there's 80 other explanations. But the truth is, you're probably never going to know for sure, in the sense that you're never going to be able to satisfy everybody. It's always going to be a mystery that, as Nick has pointed out, is now moving into the realm of myth and legend and folklore. And so in 500 years, it'll be like King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, this folkloric tale. And yet, you're right. The certainly Jack the Ripper's in that realm, and things like the Zodiac Killer. I mean, 50 years later, there's people out there who expect to actually discover the identity. Good luck with that, is what I would tell them.
And the interesting thing also, again, we got to remember about Zodiac, that kind of thematically ties into our mystery, the 1915 mystery, is that he said, when he was talking about the 37 other victims that were not found, he said he made some of them look like suicides and others look like accidents.
Right.
And in the 1950 mystery, we have 3 alleged suicides, 2 that are, I think all 3 are questionable, 2 that are very questionable, and we have the 1 accident, the so-called boating accident. And so, you look at these things, and remember, as an investigator, those things just kind of raise little flags. They kind of tickle your gut, your intuition. You go, there's something there. I can't quite place it. It may be nothing, but there's enough there to want to dig into and take a closer look at.
So what we've taken out of this part of our conversation is that The Empire of the Wheel is a book that folks interested in serial killers and true crime, particularly in California, might want to pick up. If you're interested in Aleister Crowley and some speculative kind of things about what he might have been involved in, or occult murders or anything like that, you might want to pick up the book. If you're a fan of mine and want to see sort of the genesis of how I become the next Zodiac serial killer in 2015, you might want to pick up the book. If you're a police officer listening to this, you might not want to pick up the book, and do not come to my house, because I'm not going to be the Zodiac killer. Which is exactly what somebody who's going to become the next Zodiac killer would say. No, it's not going to be me. Of course I'm not. Yeah.
The next book delves very much again into this whole Zodiac thing and the idea of the possible recurrence. That's just part of it, but it does get into the whole, and of course the Hecate thing, which we'll whet the listeners' appetite with that. We won't discuss unless you have a particular reason you want to. We'll kind of just tease them with the Hecate thing, because the book really gets into what the Hecate connection is.
No, I'm all about teasing and not actually fulfilling somebody's expectations. So that's good. Tease is good. Let me think here. Was there anything else besides getting into movies, which would be an entirely different show, as it turns out? Anything else I wanted to ask you? No, I think that's it. Often I do a short snapper section where I just fire questions out, but all my questions would be related to UFOs, so I'm not going to do that. Because you're boycotting UFOs.
Go ahead and ask one UFO question if you want.
That's very kind and generous of you to offer, but I take people at their word when they say, you don't want to talk about UFOs anymore. I'm kidding you when I mention UFOs, but you said no more UFOs. I'm good with that, frankly.
Good.
But what I do have to ask you is, have you figured out what your song is going to be yet that I can play you out to?
Oh, yeah. You know what? It's something that I've been listening to lately. It's a song I like. It's I don't know if you have it. It should be easy to find, but it is Gorillaz' Melancholy Hill.
As it turns out, yes, I do have that.
Okay, did I make myself a cheesehead by...
No. Why would you be a cheesehead? Wait, aren't they Green Bay Packer fans? Wisconsin-type people? Cheeseheads?
Well, I meant being cheesy more than...
Oh. No, cheesy would have been if you had chosen, I don't know, a band like the Ramones.
Oh, okay, we'll see.
Because they clearly have no talent.
No, I'm just not that hip. I'm like the least hip guy. One of the least hip guys you've probably ever met.
See, but you just said, I am not like the least hip guy. So I know what you were doing. You started with, I am not hip, but then you changed it to, I'm the least hip guy. But the way it came together... See, synchronicities. The way it came together, it came out, I am not like the least hip guy you've ever met, which is to say you are the most hip guy we've ever met.
Yeah, is that an interesting way of putting it?
It might be the title of the episode. Walter Bosley, not the least hip guy you've ever met. Oh, that wasn't an ambulance, but it was a Canadian goose or something. Some honking creature is in my backyard. Maybe it's the Zodiac killer.
Loosely related to Mothman.
The what?
Gooseman, loosely related to Mothman. Get Andy Colvin in on this.
I thought you said loose man, goosely related to the Mothman. What kind of strange world are we in here? Okay, so we'll do the Gorillaz song. I'll look that up. What was the name of the song again?
Melancholy Hill.
Melancholy Hill. How can I forget that? It's the story of my life, except for the hill. So that's been The Other Side of Truth with Walter Bosley. The book is The Empire of the Wheel, and many other things. I will put links up to your publishing company and your various blogs. Folks can check out your filmmaking blog and see how Hell's Bells is coming along, and whatever else you're cooking, as The Rock would say. And yeah, thanks for coming on, Walter. It's been good talking to you, as always.
Thanks for having me on, Paul.
All right, folks, tune in next time when I discuss my further adventures as the next Zodiac killer. Thanks again. Toodaloo.